Welcome to the third session of our study on the Apocrypha, where today we will begin the Third Book of Maccabees. We have said before that Third Maccabees really doesn't have anything to do with the Maccabean War. It is a story about Jews in Egypt about 50 years before the start of the Maccabean War. It is included in the Greek Septuagint and the Syriac Peshitta, as well as most manuscripts of the Armenian Bible. It was not, however, included in the Latin Vulgate. That may explain why it was not included in the canon of the Roman Catholic Church or in the traditional Protestant Apocrypha. It is included in the canon of the Eastern Orthodox churches, however. We're also going to talk more about the Apocrypha and some of the books of historical fiction found there. Of course, all of these books have a religious message, but they can also make for very interesting reading. We will discuss some of them before we get into the Third Maccabees. But before any of that, we begin with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. In this study, we are looking closely at three of the books of the Apocrypha. You may at some point want to read some of the other books included in this collection. We said in session 2 that Judith, Tobit, Esther, Susanna, and Bel and the Dragon are also short historical fictions or novels written to convey a moral point as well as to entertain. If you don't own a copy of the Apocrypha, you can find each of these online at various Bible sites like biblia.com or Bible Gateway. If you have access to a Catholic Bible like the New American Bible, all these books can be found there. Tobit, Judith, and the Greek version of Esther are each about 15 pages long in my Common English Bible. Susanna and Bel and the Dragon are each only a couple of pages. They're fairly short. After the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, Tobit, his wife Anna, and his son Tobias were exiled from their home in Galilee to Assyria. Tobit found himself in the service of a foreign ruler, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser. Tobit was later removed from his position and then persecuted for burying unattended corpses of his fellow Jews and is later on blinded. There is the story of his relative Sarah, who has had 7 grooms killed on their wedding night. Tobit's son Tobias, along with the angel Raphael, travel to Media and find some adventure along the way. And of course, there is the magical fish, which ties all of these storylines together. Certainly a fun story. That's Tobit. Judith is a story of a young Jewish woman who seduces an Assyrian general, is invited into his tent where she cuts his head off, then escapes the enemy camp with his head in her basket. Michelangelo depicted the story of Judith and the general Holofernes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The Greek version of the book of Esther from the Septuagint is similar to the Hebrew version that we are more familiar with. One significant difference is that the Greek version actually mentions God. There is no mention of God in the original Hebrew version. The story takes place during the reign of the Babylonian king Ahasuerus the Great, that is Xerxes I, who reigned from 486 to 465 BCE. Esther's uncle Mordecai had been exiled by Nebuchadnezzar in 597, making him well over 100 years old at the time his niece Esther came to town. This, along with several other historical and inaccurate elements, tells us the story is fiction, but it is still a wonderful story. Mordecai saves the king's life. Esther finds favor with the king, but the villain Haman threatens the lives of her people, the Jews, who refuse to worship the king. She risks her own life in confronting the king. Again, the story is fairly short and may be worth your time in the time you spend reading it. Bel and the Dragon, a story about false gods, and Susanna, a detective story, are both included in the additions to the book of Daniel. They are both only a few pages long and can be fun reads if you can find copies of them. In this session, we begin another work of fiction. Third Maccabees is classified as a religious novel. It is a fictional story about Egyptian Jews and Ptolemy IV Philopator, who reigned from 221 to 204 BCE, a half century before the Maccabean period. Third Maccabees belongs to a narrative genre that was especially popular among Jews who lived in the diaspora outside the land of Israel. Other examples are found in the book of Esther and in Daniel 2 through 6 that we just described. These stories tell of some great danger that threatens the Jewish community, which is then averted either through heroic action in Esther or more typically through divine intervention. Such stories provide both entertainment and edification, allowing the Jewish readers to confront their fears of destruction and then allaying those fears by the happy ending. So we begin the first chapter of the third book of Maccabees. Chapter 1, and this is the story of the Battle of Raphia. Well, that's how it starts. When Philopator learned from those who returned that the regions that he had controlled had been seized by Antiochus, he gave orders to all his forces, both infantry and cavalry, took with him his sister Arsenio, and marched out to the region near Raphia, where the army of Antiochus was encamped. But a certain Theodotus, determined to carry out the plot he had devised, took with him the best of the Ptolemaic arms that had been previously issued to him and crossed over by night to the tent of Ptolemy, intending single-handedly to kill him and thereby end the war. But Dosius, known as the son of Demalius, a Jew by birth who later changed his customs and abandoned the ancestral traditions, had led the king away and arranged that a certain insignificant man should sleep in the tent. And so it turned out that this man incurred the punishment meant for the king. A fierce battle ensued, and when matters were turning out rather in favor of Antiochus, Arsenio went to the troops with wailing and tears, her locks all disheveled, and exhorted them to defend themselves and their children and their wives bravely, promising to give them each 2 minas of gold if they won the battle. And so it came about that the enemy was routed in the action, and many captives who were taken. Now that he had foiled the plot, Ptolemy decided to visit the neighboring cities and encourage them. By doing this, and by endowing their sacred enclosures with gifts, he strengthened the morale of his subjects. The abruptness with which this book opens, and the uses of the Greek conjunctive particle day, may indicate that there was once an introduction to 3 Maccabees that has since been lost. Day means but, or and, or rather, or then, any of which implies that something came before, something that we haven't seen. The account of the battle we just read may have survived from a historical source. In any case, we will need a little background information to understand what is going on here. We said that this was historical fiction. Much of the story we are reading is based on historical events that began with the battle between Ptolemy and Antiochus. Ptolemy IV was king of Egypt from 221 to 204 BCE. Antiochus was Antiochus III, later called Antiochus the Great. He was king of Syria from 223 to 187. Those who returned, described in the first verse, would be fugitives who had escaped the battle with the Syrians. The area Antiochus captured from Egypt was at least a part of, if not most of, Palestine. Ptolemy and his army marched northeast from Egypt to Raphia, a city in Palestine 3 miles from Gaza, near the border with Sinai. The plotter, Theodotus, had been the chief commander of Egyptian forces in Syria, but became disaffected and deserted to Antiochus III. It was Theodotus' plan to kill Ptolemy, but Dosius thwarted the plan by substituting an unfortunate stand-in who was killed in the king's stead. A battle ensued, and Ptolemy's sister, Arsenio, who later became his wife, appealed to the troops and motivated them to win the battle. According to the historian Polybus, Antiochus lost about 10,000 infantry, 300 cavalry, and 4,000 prisoners as a result of the battle. Ptolemy, on the other hand, lost only about 1,500 infantry and about 700 cavalry. After his victory, Ptolemy is going on to visit other neighboring cities, and he heads to Jerusalem. So let's go on, read verses 8 through 15. Since the Jews had sent some of their council and elders to greet him, to bring him gifts of welcome, and to congratulate him on what had happened, he was all the more eager to visit them as soon as possible. After he had arrived in Jerusalem, he offered sacrifice to the supreme God and made thank offerings and did what was fitting for the place. Then, upon entering the place and being impressed by its excellence and its beauty, he marveled at the good order of the temple and conceived a desire to enter the sanctuary. When they said that this was not permitted because not even members of their own nation were allowed to enter, not even all the priests, but only the high priest, who is preeminent over all, and he only once a year, the king was by no means persuaded. Even after the law had been read to him, he did not cease to maintain that he ought to enter, saying, "Even if those men are deprived of this honor, I ought not to be." And he inquired why, when he entered every other temple, no one there had stopped him. And someone answered thoughtlessly that it was wrong to place any significance in that. But since this has happened, the king said, "Why should I not at least enter, whether they wish it or not?" The supreme God that Ptolemy made sacrifices to in verse 9 is the God that the Jews referred to as the Most High God. It was customary for kings to show respect to local deities. There is no other historical record of Ptolemy attempting to enter the Holy of Holies. The Roman general Pompey did enter it in 63 b.c.e, but otherwise there is no evidence of any non-high priest who ever entered the inner sanctuary. Let's go on to verse 16. Then the priests in all their vestments prostrated themselves and entreated the supreme God to aid in the present situation and to avert the violence of this evil design, and they filled the temple with cries and tears. Those who remained behind in the city were agitated and hurried out, supposing that something mysterious was occurring. Young women who had been secluded in their chambers rushed out with their mothers, sprinkled their hair with dust, and filled the streets with groans and lamentations. Those women who had recently been arrayed for marriage abandoned the bridal chambers, prepared for wedded union, and neglecting proper modesty in a disorderly rush flocked together in the city. Mothers and nurses abandoned even newborn children here and there, some in houses and some in the streets, and without a backward look they crowded together at the Most High Temple. Various were the supplications of those gathered there because of what the king was profanely plotting. In addition, the bolder of the citizens would not tolerate the completion of his plans or the fulfillment of his intended purposes. They shouted to the compatriots to take arms and die courageously for the ancestral law, and created a considerable disturbance in the place. And being barely restrained by the old men and the elders, they resorted to the same posture of supplication as the others. Meanwhile, the crowd, as before, was engaged in prayer, while the elders near the king tried in various ways to change his arrogant mind from the plan that he had conceived. But he in his arrogance took heed of nothing and began now to approach, determined to bring the aforesaid plan to its conclusion. When those who were around him observed this, they turned together with our people to call upon him who has all the power to defend them in the present trouble, and not to overlook this unlawful and haughty deed. The continuous, vehement, and concerted cry of the crowds resulted in an immense uproar, for it seemed that not only the people, but also the walls and the whole earth around echoed, because indeed all at the time preferred death to the profanation of the place. We could compare this to when Pontius Pilate introduced the sacrilegious Roman standards into Jerusalem, or when Caligula attempted to have his statue installed in the temple. These did not go over well with the local Jews. Verse 18 talks about young women rushing out with their mothers. Young women were not permitted to appear in public before marriage. It is noteworthy that the militants are restrained by the elders here, in contrast to the Maccabean rebellion and to the later Jewish revolt in Rome. We're going to go on to chapter 2, which begins with a prayer of the high priest Simon. It is rather a long prayer, so we're going to begin with the first 10 verses. Chapter 2. Then the high priest Simon, facing the sanctuary, bending his knees and extending his hands with calm dignity, prayed as follows: Lord, Lord, King of the heavens and sovereign of all creation, holy among these holy ones, the only ruler, almighty, give attention to us who are suffering grievously from an impious and profane man, puffed up in his audacity and power. For you, the creator of all things and the governor of all, are a just ruler, and you judge those who have done anything in insolence and arrogance. You destroyed those who in past committed injustice, among whom were even giants and who trusted in their strength and boldness, whom you destroyed by bringing on them a boundless flood. You consumed with fire and sulfur the people of Sodom, who acted arrogantly, who were notorious for their vices, and you made them an example to those who should come afterward. By inflicting many and varied punishments on the audacious Pharaoh who had enslaved your holy people Israel, you made known your sovereignty. Thus you made known your great strength. And when he pursued them with chariots and a mass of troops, you overwhelmed him in the depths of the sea, but carried through safely those who had put their confidence in you, the ruler over the whole creation. And when they had seen the works of your hand, they praised you, the Almighty. You, O King, when you had created the boundless and immeasurable earth, chose this city and sacrificed this place for your name, though you have no need of anything. And when you had glorified it by your magnificent manifestation, you made it a firm foundation for the glory of your great and honored name. And because you love the house of Israel, you promised that if we should have reverses and tribulation should overtake us, you would listen to our petition when we come to this place and pray. Simon II, son of Onias II, and called Simon the Just, was high priest from about 219 to 196 BCE. The prayer is a classic Jewish form, like Eleazar's prayer in chapter 6, follows the pattern of Psalm 105 and 106 in confessing the sins of the people by calling on God to deliver them as he had done in the past. The giants the prayer talks about in verse 4 are among the race of heroes whose origins are described in Genesis chapter 6, but also mentioned elsewhere in the Apocrypha. Let's go on with verses 11 through the end of the prayer. And indeed you are faithful and true, and because oft times when the fathers were oppressed, you helped them in their humiliation and rescued them from great evils. See now, O Holy King, that because of our many and great sins, we are crushed with suffering, subjected to our enemies, and overtaken by helplessness. In our downfall, this audacious and profane man undertakes to violate the holy place on earth, dedicated to your glorious name. For your dwelling is the heaven of heavens, unapproachable by human beings. But because you are pleased that your glory should dwell among your people, Israel, you sanctified this place. Do not punish us for the defilement committed by these men, or call us to account for this profanation. Otherwise the transgressors will boast in their wrath and exult in the arrogance of their tongue, saying, We have trampled down the house of holiness as the houses of the abominations are trampled down. Wipe away our sins and disperse our errors. Reveal your mercy at this hour. Speedily let your mercies overtake us, but praises in the mouths of those who are downcast and broken in spirit, and give us peace. So verse 17 says that because of our many and great sins, we are crushed with suffering, subjected to our enemies, and overtaken by helplessness, even though in this instant the Jewish community has done nothing wrong. This kind of confession of sin was standard operating procedure in prayers of this type. He asks for mercy and peace. The question now is, what is God going to do about all this? Simon has prayed his prayer, and now it is up to God. Let's read verses 21 through 24. Thereupon God, who oversees all things, the first father of all, holy among the holy ones, having heard the lawful supplication, scourged him who had exalted himself in insolence and audacity. He shook him on the side, and that as a reed is shaken by the wind, so that he lay helpless on the ground, and besides being paralyzed in his limbs, was unable to even speak, since he was ensnared by a righteous judgment. Then both friends and bodyguards, seeing the severe punishment that had overtaken him and fearing that he would lose his life, quickly dragged him out, panic-stricken in their exceeding great fear. After a while he recovered, and though he had been punished, he by no means repented, but went away uttering bitter threats. God paralyzes Ptolemy. When Helidorius tried to enter the inner sanctuary in search of treasures, he was attacked by a horse whose rider wore armor and carried weapons of gold. Antiochus was struck with incurable and invisible blows, and his flesh rotted away. Both of those stories are found in the second book of Maccabees. But here we are told that after his recovery, Ptolemy still did not repent. We go on, verse 25. When he arrived in Egypt, he increased in his deeds of malice, abetted by the previously mentioned drinking companions and comrades who were strangers to everything just. He was not content with his uncounted licentious deeds, but even continued with such audacity that he established an evil reputation in the various localities, and many of his friends, intently observing the king's purpose, themselves also followed his will. He proposed to inflict public disgrace on the nation, and he set up a stone on the tower in the courtyard with this inscription: "None of those who do not sacrifice shall enter their sanctuaries, and all Jews shall be subjected to a registration involving poll tax, to the status of slaves. Those who object to this are to be taken by force and put to death. Those who are registered are also to be branded on their bodies by fire with the ivy leaf symbol of Dionysus, and they shall also be reduced to their former limited status. In order that he may not appear to be an enemy of all, he inscribed below, but if any of them prefer to join those who have been initiated into the mysteries, they shall have equal citizenship with the Alexandrians." In verse 25, our story refers to Ptolemy's previously mentioned drinking buddies. In fact, the present text of Third Maccabees does not mention them. This is additional evidence that the opening or introductory section of the book has been lost. The claim that Jews were forbidden to enter their sanctuaries means their synagogues. Synagogue worship was disrupted in Alexandria, Egypt in 38 BCE, and the poll tax was imposed by Rome in 24 BCE. This is the only tax that is known to entail the reduction in status of the Jews, since it classified them with Egyptians rather than Greeks. Ptolemy Philopator was a devotee of the Greek god Dionysus and may himself have been branded. Branding was also used to identify slaves in case they ran away. This work was originally written in Greek by an unknown Egyptian Jew. The date was written is disputed by today's scholars. Some suggest a date as early as 100 BCE. Others argue that the threatened change in the status of the Jews and the promise of Alexandrian citizenship to those who abandon the religion reflect the situation of Alexandrian Jews after Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE. It seems reasonable that the sanctuary restrictions and taxation initiatives described in verses 28 and 29 reflect events that happened late in the 1st century BCE. So let's go on to verse 31 through the end of the chapter. Now some, with an obvious abhorrence of the price to be extracted for maintaining the piety of their city, readily gave themselves up, since they expected to enhance their reputation by their future association with the king. But the majority acted firmly with a courageous spirit and did not abandon their piety. By paying money in exchange for life, they boldly attempted to save themselves from the registration. They remained resolutely hopeful of obtaining help, and they abhorred those who separated themselves from them, considering them to be enemies of the nation, depriving them of common fellowship and mutual help. Verse 32 talks about paying money in exchange for life. This refers to paying bribes. The enemies of the Jewish nation described in the final verses are renegade Jews, who were considered even worse than the Gentile Egyptian persecutors. Large numbers of Jews never returned to the land of Israel following the Babylonian exile. Many remained in the diaspora. Many Jews settled in Alexandria in Egypt, and it is thought that many of the books of the Greek Septuagint were written by Jews living in Alexandria. This book is clearly not a historical account, although it does depict some earlier historical events, such as the Battle of Raphia, known from other sources. So why read a book that is not historically accurate? Why read Hamlet, or To Kill a Mockingbird, or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Robinson Crusoe? Of course, it is not necessary for any book to be historically accurate for it to deliver a meaningful message. We read these books because we know we can find truth in them. Putting ourselves in the shoes of others, even fictional characters, helps us grow our capacity for empathy. They can open our minds, and ultimately they may help us see God in ways that pure, non-fictional history may not. Most of us are not being tortured or forced to abandon our religious beliefs, but there are certainly things that we can learn from these ancient stories of a people living in a foreign land. In our next session, we'll read and discuss chapters 3, 4, and 5 of the Third Book of Maccabees. Much of the rest of the book describes the persecution of the Jews in Egypt. The vast majority of the Jews resist Ptolemy's efforts, and with great cruelty, they are herded together to be registered, tortured, and put to death. Again, they will seek divine intervention. Our next Zoom session will be Monday at 6:30 p.m. If you would like to participate, don't forget to let me know. You can send an email to online.classes@northgateumc.org, and I will send you the Zoom link. Have a good week.